Okay, welcome everybody to the first online seminar of the Irish Social Policy Association. I suppose the mantra of this year has been we're all in this together. So we thought it would be a good topic to talk about social cohesion in time of pandemic. So we've two very expert speakers that we're really looking forward to hearing. Pete Lunn, who is Mr. Behavioural Economics at the ESRI and who's also been giving behavioural advice to NPHET, and Tony Fahey, Emeritus Professor of Social Policy in UCD, who's written very widely on all sorts of social policy issues, always very provocative and thought-provoking, and an expert on areas of social cohesion and social policy. So Pete is going to start. He's going to speak for about 20-25 minutes with a couple of slides. And if you've got questions, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And you can, and then we'll have Tony again for about 20-25 minutes with a number of slides. And after that, we'll put the questions coming in through the question answer function to our two speakers. So we hope to wrap it up in about an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half max. And thank you very much for joining us. And now I'm going to disappear and we leave you over to.
So good evening. And I have to believe that there are 36 people listening to me now, though it doesn't feel very much like it because we live in these bizarre times where I'm trying to do this from my bedroom instead of in the seminar room. But it's a pleasure to be able to talk about this. And I'm delighted to talk to you. So, as Esther says, I'm actually only going to show a couple of slides. There's a few reasons for that. One is because what I want to say, I think, is better said almost as a story rather than bullet points on a slide. So I'm largely going to tell it chronologically in that way. The second reason is because I've discovered through 8 months of Zoom meetings and trying to present PowerPoints on Zoom that I'm rubbish at it. I find it really, really difficult to talk to slides that I've made directly in front of me rather than talk as I'm talking now. So I'm going to punctuate this talk with a couple of slides that show some data, but I'm going to show far less data than Tony. I'm relying on him to do that job. I'm going to tell much more a story, and it's a story about how I see the literature on cooperation and how I then see that having fed into the COVID argument, the COVID debate, and what we've learned. So I'm going to do that essentially chronologically. And as I say, I'm going to show a couple of slides on the way through to make a couple of what I think are reasonably telling points, but otherwise I'm simply going to talk about it. My relationship with this issue goes right back to the late 1980s when I was an undergraduate in Thatcher's Britain. And being an undergraduate in Thatcher's Britain was a place where there was a huge amount of political argument. It was a country that was bitterly divided between the left and the right. And very, very often, that argument came down to what I think is an absolutely crucial research question, to which behavioural scientists now have come up with something that's pretty close to concrete answers. But at the time, very, very little was known about it actually as a research question. And that research question is pretty straightforward. It is, to what extent and when do human beings make sacrifices for the common good? When will people act for the common good instead of in their own self-interest? And that's essentially the research question. And I was always fascinated by this because so many arguments that we had as undergraduates sitting around the tables of the undergraduate bars and student bars and all the rest of it, so many of the arguments ultimately boiled down to that about what political systems should be in place and whether the kind of reforms that the Thatcher administration were pushing through that demanded that everyone have a certain set of incentives and that you simply couldn't in any way rely on people having some kind of social conscience in the way they behaved. So many arguments seem to boil down to that. Now, I can tell you that two of the people, and I won't say who they are, who I had those arguments with around those tables in the bars, are now members of Boris Johnson's government. So the argument doubtless rumbles on, and you can probably work out which side of the argument they were on and which side of the argument I was on. So the first time I came across anything that was empirical to do with this research question was actually listening to three burly South Africans, also in a bar. At the time, there was a rather, I won't give you a name for this person, but there was a rather dodgy South African guy who was a Don at Oxford, who had essentially set up a social studies diploma for 1 year. It was extremely easy to complete. had very low entry requirements and was essentially designed to allow sportsmen from South Africa and Australia to study at Oxford for a year and play sport. And during the course of this, I encountered 3 of these very burly South Africans, one of whom got a rugby blue, a cricket blue, and a golf blue all in 1 year, and a 2-2 in a diploma in social studies. And the 3 South Africans who were not interested in social studies at all, and in fact had no background in social science at all, were arguing vociferously about something they called prisoner's dilemma. And this argument, which was on a night out amongst the sports team, went on for about an hour and a half and then continued into the night when everyone else went to bed. And we were all absolutely gobsmacked. They were all talking about, these 3 South Africans were talking about this because they'd shown no interest in anything academic for the whole time we'd known them. And we tried to get them to explain to us what prisoner's dilemma was. And despite the fact that for an hour and a half, they were having a vociferous argument about what should be done if you're one of the prisoners, all 3 of them were actually incapable of explaining it to the rest of us in any way that we understood. And it was a few years later that I actually understood what it was that they had been talking about. And of course, as almost all of you, I suspect, listening to this will know, prisoner's dilemma is essentially a game. It's a piece of game theory in which people's selfish incentives and the incentive for the common good, so behavior can go either for selfish incentives or for the common good, are opposed, and people have to make a choice. And these are a whole range of game situations that you can put people in. Prisoner's dilemma is only one of them. There are others. They are called things like just social dilemmas, the common pool resource problem, or as economists often refer to it, the tragedy of the commons, a public goods game, which I'll come back to in a moment, and what I prefer, which is calling these things collective action problems, which is where you're trying to coordinate people into a collective action where their own selfish incentive would not be to support the collective cause, but we all need to support a collective cause to get a better outcome for everybody. So these kind of game structures that have these opposing incentives of the group as a whole versus the individual. Now, one of the fascinating things about this is prisoner's dilemma had been around since the 1950s. It took about 30 years for anybody to empirically test what people actually do in these circumstances. Now, of course, it's pretty difficult to produce the experiment that is, in fact, the prisoner's dilemma of 2 prisoners being locked up and facing large sentences. But of course, one can play these games for money with exactly the same structure. And the more common one, the easiest one to understand and explain very briefly, if you haven't come across it before, is the public goods game. And the simple way to explain that, which has a very similar structure to prisoner's dilemma, but has many, many, many more participants, as many as you like, is that there's a big pot in the middle of a room, and everyone has some money, and whatever money they put into the pot, the experimenters will either double or treble and then split evenly amongst everybody. Now, of course, if everyone in the room throws all of their money into the pot and it's doubled or trebled, everybody gets 2 or 3 times as much money as they put in, and they all walk away much better off. On the other hand, the selfish incentive is to put nothing in the pot, let other people put money in the pot, let it be doubled or trebled, and then take your share and walk off with more. But if everyone does that, nothing goes in the pot, so that society as a whole is poorer. So this is the classic public goods game setup. And when people first empirically started doing this stuff in the 1980s, it became clear really quickly that cooperation actually was something that people instinctively tended to do, at least until other people didn't cooperate with them, and at least quite a lot of people would do this. Now, interestingly, this empirical result came as a shock to a lot of economists and game theorists, including John Nash of Nash Equilibrium fame, who, when he was told that people did this, responded that the people involved must simply have not understood the situation they were in. So for many years after this, there were many studies done that tried to debunk these findings and tried to show that if people really understood the situation they were in, surely they would behave selfishly and not just seemingly give up free money in these circumstances. But actually, it turned out that no, they didn't. They gave up the free money and they tried to cooperate. Now, the public goods game is a particularly interesting one, because if you play that in multiple rounds with the same group of people, where everyone can see how much money goes into the pot and how much money comes out, so they can see the people who are free riding, the people who are behaving selfishly, quite quickly the contributions to the pot over repeated rounds will go down. And this is because a lot of people are what are called conditional cooperators. They will happily cooperate for the common good, provided everyone else does. And if they see that other people don't, they start to withdraw their own cooperation. And as more and more people withdraw the cooperation and reduce their contributions to the pot, contributions to the pot go down, and pretty quickly they can go pretty much all the way to zero with just a few altruists and burning martyrs left throwing their money in and losing it. But in fact, one of the classic studies that was done on this is you can change that really quickly, because that's a very unlikely society. Society isn't as atomized as this. We can see what each other are doing, but we can also respond to it. And there's a very famous study that was done by, entertainingly, a man called Ernst Fehr, spelled F-E-H-R rather than F-A-I-R, Ernst Fehr and a colleague, Klaus Schmidt, who introduced punishment into the game. And as soon as it's possible for individuals in a public goods game like that to punish other people in the game, so they can pay their own money in order to take money away from others who've behaved badly, as soon as there's any degree of social disapproval and punishment that's introduced into these games, cooperation then gets driven up. And it turns out the reason for this is largely individual differences, that somewhere around 1 in 7, probably more like 1 in 8 people will behave selfishly unless the rest of society holds them to account for it, and unless there's some kind of punishment. But most people will try to cooperate. So if you put in place a system where people can do that, that's what they'll do. So it's safe to say that for many years, I was pretty obsessed with this literature. It was kind of grounded in my background, and I thought it was a really fascinating insight into what people instinctively are like and some instinctive individual differences between people. And of course, there's huge numbers of kind of policy and social issues that have this kind of collective action problem at their heart, I mean, including kind of environmental and other sort of health issues and so on. But I mean, COVID has really brought this particular issue, these kind of collective action problems to light. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But I just want to say this, it came as a real surprise to a lot of economists that people would instinctively behave that way. And the legacy of that lives on. If you look up collective action problem now on Wikipedia, it will tell you that a collective action problem is a situation where if everybody coordinated their behavior, they could get a better social outcome, but they fail to do so, as if that's an empirical fact. And in fact, the empirics for almost 40 years point to the opposite, or close to the opposite, but that's not instinctively what people do. You can't define the problem by saying that people fail at it, which is an empirical statement, especially when the empirical statement is false. People don't. People actually will instinctively cooperate. Now, there's a lovely study, and this is going to be the first slide I'm going to show you. So there's a lovely study that has been done only this year that I like so much, I just want to share it, which just rams home this point before I turn to talk about how this applies to COVID. So I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully I'm going to put this first slide up. Here we go. At least I'm going to try to. Okay, that is refusing to work, so I'm going to start it up again and have another go. Sorry about that. It worked perfectly when I shared it in practice just a few minutes ago. Let's have another go. Tony, perhaps you can tell me whether you're seeing that.
Yes, I see it. Yeah, very
excellent. Okay, so this is, so sorry, I have no idea why that froze. Lovely. So this is a paper that was published in Psychological Science only this year. And essentially, many of you have probably heard of a very famous experiment called the marshmallow experiment, which was done on some Stanford preschoolers way back in the early 1970s, I think, in which children, preschoolers, were given a marshmallow in a very bare and empty room on a table, and told that if they could resist eating it for 10 minutes while the experimenter left the room, when the experimenter came back, they get 2 marshmallows. So this was a test of their ability to delay gratification. Now, the poor kids who were involved in that original experiment have been followed up many, many years since, because the argument is, and it's a controversial research literature, but this research literature suggests that how good they were as preschoolers at delaying gratification had an impact, or was related to, later life outcomes. Now, what's lovely about the study that Koeman has done with these colleagues here is they just changed the basic marshmallow experiment a tiny bit. And what they did was they had the classic experiment, which was just to leave the marshmallow and say to an individual kid, we'll come back in 10 minutes. If you haven't eaten it, you can have 2. And then they had another condition where the kids were in pairs, where they played with another kid for a little bit and then were isolated. And they said to the kids, and these kids were 5 and 6 years old, they said to the kids, here's a marshmallow. If you don't eat it, you'll get 2 marshmallows when I come back into the room in 10 minutes. But also in this condition, they said, but that's only true. We've done the same thing with the other kid. That's only true if the other child doesn't eat the marshmallow as well. So if you both don't eat the marshmallow, you'll get 2 when I come back in 10 minutes time. Okay, so they actually made the rewards interdependent between the 2 kids. It only met for a few minutes, were 5 and 6 years old. So what happened? You should there, I hope, be able to see a chart.
Yeah, we can see it.
Where what you can see is the solo condition there is the classic experiment. And on the left there, the interdependent experiment. And I'm not going to talk about the dependence one, which is a mechanism part of the experiment. I'm only going to talk about the 2 on the left. What you can see there is that in the interdependence condition, where the 2 kids' outcomes depended on each other and they had to cooperate to get the best outcome, led them to be more likely to delay gratification. If you're wondering why there's the orange and the green bars there, it's because one of these experiments was done in Kikuyu in Kenya amongst Kenyan kids, and one was done in Germany amongst German kids. And in both cases, although, as you can see, delayed gratification was stronger among the Kenyan kids on average, in both cases what you can see is that when it was interdependent, the kids were less likely to eat the marshmallow. If you think about that from an individual incentive point of view, actually it makes no sense because they're less likely to get the second marshmallow if they delay gratification in the interdependent condition. So from a selfish point of view, they're less likely to get the reward. Nevertheless, even kids who are 5 and 6 years old, when there's the opportunity for them to cooperate with each other, that's instinctively what they do when they're having to make a sacrifice and delay their own gratification, knowing their outcome depends on somebody else and that person's outcome depends on their behavior. So this instinctive cooperation even can be shown in an experiment. It's a lovely little experiment, I think, going right back to kids who are only 5 and 6 years old. Okay, so that rams home the fact that not only are we instinctive cooperators, but this is something essentially we teach our kids too. Now, I want to talk about how this relates to COVID. So there's a whole literature there, which I've been fascinated with about how people cooperate. And it became pretty clear when we were getting into kind of February and March that this literature was highly relevant to what was about to happen to Ireland. And there was a day in the ESRI, I remember it very clearly, I was trying to work with a colleague on something and I couldn't concentrate. And eventually I just put the stuff down and I went into Alan Barrett's, the director's office, and I said, look, I want my team to drop everything and go away and work on a review of behavioural literature for fighting COVID. And that's what we did. We dropped everything. Alan said, yes, I'm delighted to say, and we dropped everything and we just went away and produced a review of the relevant behavioural literature. Now that included things like interventions to promote hand washing and to help people through self-isolation and so on. But the biggest section in that, and I think in many ways the most important one, was trying to round up this literature on when people instinctively cooperate in order to try and get the lessons from it for fighting COVID. Because what was becoming clear was that what society was going to have to do was make individual sacrifices for the common good. And that this had to happen on such a massive scale faced with the challenge that we faced. There was no way this could be done by simple regulation and enforcement, although that might make a contribution. It had to overwhelmingly depend on people's voluntary compliance to do this. And therefore this literature, this willingness of people to make sacrifices for the common good was highly relevant. So we went away to review it. And from that, we drew really 3 lessons, I think. One is that cooperation is higher when there is a really clear articulation that is repeated of why the strategy is best for everybody. So that the strategy that if everybody behaves in a certain way, you get the best collective outcome. If that is repeated in communication and the cause and effect is clear to everybody, that makes a really big difference to whether people cooperate. The other thing is common group identity. The stronger the common group identity of a group, you know, the more they know each other, the more they have common bonds and things in common. And if they're part of a team, anything like that, that group identity makes a difference to people's ability to cooperate. And finally, there needs to be some degree of punishment, even if it's just social disapproval, to support that cooperation. So we put all of this in the review. And at the time, we also thought it was pretty important because there was an argument going on, particularly in Britain, about what they were calling behavioural fatigue. And the idea here was that essentially people wouldn't be able to abide by social restrictions for very long. They tire them really quickly, and consequently you only had a short window of behavior change. We decided here that argument was wrong, and that actually the literature on cooperation suggested you could maintain cooperation for really quite long periods of time. That you could get a cooperative equilibrium, essentially, where if enough people are cooperating with each other and they can see each other cooperating, it can sustain for quite a long time. And we put that argument into the literature, into the paper, and the paper was circulated in government sometime around mid-March. I forget the exact date now, just before actually the first restrictions were put in place and the schools were closed. And it's always the case that you never know how much, you know, the work you do feeds into policy, how much influence it actually has. But it certainly had some, because many of those arguments were repeated back to us. One thing I really like to say about this is at the time, and I wish I'd actually written it down at the time, there was a group of us as behavioural scientists who were chatting about this, and we agreed that we thought way back in March that a couple of things were really likely. One thing that was likely, and this is going to interact with what Tony's going to tell us, I think. One thing we thought was really likely was that small countries that were more cohesive were more likely to do well in fighting the disease. Now, of course, scholars are probably going to debate for 20 years what has led to, you know, and produce models and all the rest of it, what has led to different outcomes for different countries. And of course, the cross-sectional sample isn't large enough, and it kind of reminds you of all those sort of growth regressions of people trying to work out cross-country differences in growth rates and all the rest of it. I mean, it's a debate that may not be resolved. And that's why I wish I'd written it down at the time, because we said at the time, look, this is going to happen. We predicted this, that smaller, more cohesive countries would do better. And one of the things that's fascinating, actually, is if you compare small countries, particularly small countries that have larger, traditionally more dominant neighbours, they've all done better than their larger, traditionally more dominant neighbours. So of course you can take Ireland and England, and Ireland has done spectacularly well by comparison in terms of case numbers and deaths and so on. You can take Canada versus the United States. You can take Denmark versus Germany and Sweden. You can take Portugal versus Spain. You can take New Zealand versus Australia. Wherever there is this rivalry between a smaller country and a more dominant neighbour, the smaller country, which our prediction was would behave more cohesively and coordinate itself better, has done better. We also thought at the time that it was highly likely that the countries that had greater degrees of populism and greater degrees of political polarization were going to do worse. And that's exactly what's happened in the case of the UK, the US, and to some extent we think Italy too. And again, this was something that was said before the fact as a prediction. But of course, you know, there are many, many variables, and perhaps there are other reasons, and that's just a correlation, and maybe it's not causal, but certainly that's what, as behavioral scientists at the time, we thought was likely to happen. Okay, throughout the COVID period, there was a behavioral change subgroup that fed arguments into NPHET. And one of the arguments that we fed in a lot was to say, look, it's really, really important that you keep talking about how many people are complying and don't stress non-compliance too much, because one of the things we know is people are conditional cooperators. Their compliance depends on others. And we've tried to do that throughout, and with some success. And at one point, when the guards were focusing very strongly on compliance, we fed in messages, no, always say the majority of people are complying first, because it's important. So this just brings me to my final slide that I just want to show you about what has happened during this period. So I'm going to put a second slide up before I leave you to show how some of this cooperation has worked its way out. So I've unfortunately got an animate down the bottom that's gone ahead of time, which is kind of giving a bit of a game away. But anyway, okay, this is a personal worry index that comes from the tracking data. We've taken tracking data, say we, the behavioural change subgroup, has taken tracking data throughout COVID, and there is, it's an Emeritus survey that's done every week. It's a high quality Emeritus survey with about 1,500, 1,700 people. This is an index of worry, a simple score out of 10, where you can see the kind of key moments there of the Irish lockdown, the easing of restrictions, the move to level 5. And you can see a very distinctive shape about how worried people are in general about COVID. I put that up there because I think it gives you a real hint about what's driving behavior. If it really was true that people have behavioral fatigue, you would expect a general decline in people's compliance with restrictions and so on. If it's being driven instead by a desire to cooperate, as the risk gets bigger, the dangers to society get bigger, you should see greater cooperation kick in. And I'm going to show you, there's multiple charts that could show you this. They all look exactly the same. I'm going to show one because I think this is probably one of the more persuasive ones. This is self-reported staying at home rather than going out among the Irish population. Now, if there is any general downward trend there, it's pretty small compared to the oscillations that we can see, which are much more accurately mapping the degree to which people are worried about the disease, which itself tracks really quite closely the daily case numbers. In other words, it looks like the perceived risk that people have drives a degree of worry. And of course, these are correlations, and one could do fancy time series econometrics and never solve exactly what's driving what here. But what's definitely true is that people's level of compliance, as measured by this and many other metrics, this is just one example I'm going to put up here, people's level of compliance here very, very closely matches the case numbers and the degree of worry and the feeling of a need to actually cooperate to fight the disease as it grows and declines. So of course, one of the big questions is how do you maintain that cooperation when you're in periods of lower case numbers in order to stop the growth ever getting started, because that nonlinear growth causes problems. Now, of course, people get very skeptical about self-reported compliance, and this is a fight we've had throughout COVID about the degree of that. So what I'm going to show you now is reports, and I inserted this question actually into the tracking survey because I think it's quite persuasive. My experience is, yes, in surveys, people try to make themselves look good. They self-report themselves looking good. They're not so inclined to report that about other people, though. So we had a question inserted which asked them about the compliance behavior of others. And when you look at that, now we only started that in May, it's a noisier data series, partly because it's responding to news events. As you can see, I've popped Golfgate in just for a little bit of fun there. I don't know, of course I don't, it's just a correlation, whether that's causal, but it is interesting that perception of other people's compliance began to fall following Golfgate. But overwhelmingly, the pattern follows very similarly the pattern that we see in the self-reported compliance as well. So I think that science of cooperation and using that science of cooperation and understanding its basic empirics has fed into a lot of what the Irish government did. I think if I'm honest, we were doing it better earlier in the COVID pandemic. I think we got some of that messaging better at that time. It obviously became harder the more we returned to politics as usual and people were fighting on either side of a kind of health versus economics trade-off, such as it was perceived. I'll leave you with one final point, which is this. I think one of the biggest mistakes we made can be seen in the chart up on the right there, the top right, which is to say that actually when the restrictions eased, people were so worried about this disease, it took them a long time to come back out. They didn't suddenly come back out. They weren't dying to get back out and start doing things again. They did it gradually. And in fact, they did it over a period of over 2 months, you can see before that chart starts to bottom out. Now, even then, some people are going out less. This is reporting the percentage who say they go out less. But that didn't even bottom out until sometime around August. So there's a kind of behavioral lag in how people are responding to the restrictions that are put in place. But overwhelmingly, this is a story of massive social cooperation, which is exactly what the behavioral literature would predict people would do, especially if they have this common aim that is repeated and is sensible and where they can see the cause and effect. So that's what I'll leave you with. I hope that's been interesting. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Pete. That was very interesting. And I'm sure we'll have lots of questions coming through in due course on the Q&A. And now I want to move over to Tony, and you'll talk about social cohesion in the bigger picture.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ethna, and thanks to everybody for joining in. As Ethna said, I wanted to look at a somewhat bigger picture than what Pete was talking about. In other words, I'm not going to talk specifically about the COVID crisis, but about what I think might be said as a general characteristic of social life in Ireland now is that there is a very high level of what might be called cohesion. Now, I'm going to throw up a slide here. Wait, now I get this right. To start off with, this
Your
one.
share screen is at the bottom and the green arrow.
Can you see it now?
Not yet.
No.
You've got to click on the share screen.
I am clicking, but oh, share. Yes, I see that. Yeah. Yeah. This is a measure of dissatisfaction with democracy roughly over the last 25 years in 65 countries from a preserving democracy project in the University of Cambridge. Now, what's shown here, the bottom scale is dissatisfaction with democracy. So on the top right corner here, we have a range of countries where there's almost 100% dissatisfaction with democracy. And then down, we have other countries like the United States here, about 60%, United Kingdom about 70%, France around 70%. And the direction of these arrows indicate that over the last 25 years, the red arrows means that dissatisfaction has been rising. Now, the interest here is down on the bottom, because Ireland is in a group of countries down on the bottom, which the authors of this report refer to as islands of contentment, in that levels of dissatisfaction with democracy is extremely low. And the direction of the arrow is to the left, which means that dissatisfaction is less now than it was 25 years ago. So Ireland belongs with this, it's a group of Northern European countries, mainly the Netherlands, Ireland, Norway, Luxembourg, Denmark, Switzerland, where there's very, very low levels of dissatisfaction with democracy. Now, this is only one measure, and you might rightly be a bit skeptical about a single measure like this, but I think there is a case to be made that the kind of, what I'm going to talk about really is, it might better be called political cohesion rather than social cohesion. And I'm going to talk a good bit about political cohesion, because I think one of the outstanding features of Irish life over recent decades has been the absence of the kind of political polarization which has emerged in many Western democracies. So I'm going to talk about political, it might be called political polarization, political cohesion, rather than social isolation, or the classic sense of the disconnected individual. Pete was talking about the circumstances under which individuals are willing to make sacrifices for the sake of the common good. But of course, what stands out in many countries in recent times is not so much individuals detaching themselves from the common good, but rather individuals coalescing together in almost tribal groups within societies and engaging in intense conflict with other groups whom they define as somehow illegitimate in their membership of society. So it's political division of a very profound kind, of a sort really that has surprised commentators in much of the Western world in recent times, that this degree of polarization should emerge in what for the most part are relatively wealthy Western democracies, although as was shown in that study of dissatisfaction with democracies, it's in places like Latin America that really high levels of dissatisfaction with democracy have arisen. Now, I think that there is what's striking in the present century really is the absence of that populist wave in Ireland. Now, by populism here, I mean one of the fundamental indicators of it are characteristics that are used to identify it, is this sense of a political leadership which emerges and purports to speak on behalf of the people, versus elites who have somehow betrayed the people and are therefore somehow illegitimate, or their genuineness as members of the political community is in question. Now, these movements are often very nationalist, they're intensely hostile to immigrants, anti-globalist. Sometimes the nationalism is cultural, sometimes it's economic. And I'll just pick out one example here of an instance of this, or evidence of this kind of characteristic in Irish life in recent times, and it has to do really with the role of migration, inward migration in Western democracies, as one of the focal points for the emergence of political polarization. Now, the Finland is an interesting comparator with Ireland in that context. In the early 2000s, Finland and Ireland were both had in common that they had tiny populations of non-nationals, about 2.5% in each case. Over the first decade of the 20th century, inward migration surged in both Finland and in Ireland. The size of the non-national population went up about threefold between 2000 and 2010. and it became an intense focus of controversy within Finland. And the True Finns Party emerged at this time. The True Finns Party was founded in 1995 and became the main voice for anti-immigrant sentiment, Euroscepticism. It was also socially conservative. The gay rights movement, gay marriage became a bone of contention in their view, and it was interpreted on their part as a betrayal of Finnish culture. Now, they were very protective of the Finnish welfare state, but of course this also got caught up in anti-immigrant sentiment because the immigrant pressure on the welfare state was one of the causes of their resentment with trends in Finland at the time. Now, in Ireland at the same period, also with a surge in inward migration, but of a much larger scale than in Finland, where the Finnish non-national population rose threefold, the Irish non-national population was about fivefold over the same decade. Now, Ireland, of course, in 2008, then 2009, had a major recession, and unemployment soared to 15 or 16% within 2 or 3 years. And I know that if anyone had said to me in 2007 that we were going to go from full employment to 15% unemployment over the next 3 or 4 years, and that we were going to, by that time, have a very large chunk of immigrant workers in the population newly arrived in Ireland, you might have been expected to say, well, yes, there's very likely that in both Finland and Ireland had elections in 2011, and certainly in the Finnish election in 2011, the True Finns made a lot of capital out of an anti-immigrant stance. Now, the remarkable thing in Ireland was that, in fact, immigration didn't feature as an issue in the 2000 election at all, which I think is quite an extraordinary thing. And indeed, throughout the entire sequence of elections that we've had since the turn of the present century, there was a bit of an upsurge about an issue made of immigration in the 2002 election. There was a suspicion that it might emerge in the recent election earlier this year. Peter Casey, as you may remember, made a few statements about travellers in the presidential election in 2018, and some people felt that this is the beginning now of a movement where, again, a kind of a populist targeting of segments of the community that are deemed somehow illegitimate, that this could emerge in national politics in Ireland. But Peter Casey sort of faded out over the following 3 years. He ran in the presidential election in 2018 and the European elections in 2019. He went from 23% of the vote in 2018. In the European elections in the North West constituency, his vote share about halved. And in the general election this year, he simply didn't feature. And nobody else really came forward in this period to capitalize on anti-immigrant sentiment. Now, there's a whole range of other aspects. Globalization, anti-Euroscepticism is hardly an issue in Ireland. I'll talk in a while about this business of social conservatism, because again, I think social conservatism in Ireland is, in fact, has a very particular role to play in political consensus and political solidarity or political cohesion in Ireland. Now, in the international literature on the rise of populism and the rise of movements like anti-immigrant sentiment, there is a broad divide between demand side and supply side explanations. Demand side explanations focus on the characteristics of the population and their experiences and say, and ask, are there things going on in the population that make them, that turn them in a populist direction? Whereas supply side approaches focus much more on the role of political leadership, rather that. So if you look at a place like, say, Britain over the same period compared to Ireland, Britain had Nigel Farage, Ireland didn't. And it is possible to imagine that someone might have emerged in Ireland of the same kinds of populist, rabble-rousing skills that Nigel Farage had. And had such a person, say, for example, had Peter Casey had he had the skills and the determination and the willingness to rock the boat that Nigel Farage had, that perhaps there was indeed a potential audience for that brand of politics, but that nobody has come forward with both the skills and the political skills, the communication skills, and the intent to capitalize on it. Now, likewise, you might say the same of Trump or these figures in many countries around Europe who suddenly shot to prominence because they've been willing to say outrageous things in the context of the liberal traditions of Western democracy. And they've done it with great determination and great skill. And in consequence, in many countries have garnered a very substantial share of the vote on that account. Now, it may simply be the case in Ireland that the reason this hasn't happened in Ireland is that no such a person has emerged. And that next year, someone might pop up and start saying things about immigrants or about the European Union or about traditional Irish culture and Irish values that would generate a wave of support in the population and might garner votes in a forthcoming election in the future. So that's always a possibility, that when you're trying to explain these kinds of things, that the demand side is, or the supply side is a feature. But to return to this idea of the supply side, I'm going to look at what might be pointed to as a fairly obvious feature of the recent Irish experience, in which all kinds of national issues have been couched. And that is the extraordinary upsurge in prosperity that has occurred in Ireland really since the late 1980s. And on the left here, we have two measures of rising prosperity in Ireland, one GNP per person, the other mean household income. Going back to 1973, we see from 1973 until the late 1980s, the trend line is fairly flat, and then it suddenly shot upwards. And just looking at mean household income rather than GNP, but looking at mean household income between 1987 and 2007, 20-year period, mean household income went up roughly in real terms, and this is in inflation-corrected figures. In real terms, mean household income went up 2.5-fold. And when we looked then at the crisis that emerged in 2007, 2008, there certainly was a dip, but even taking the dip really did little to dent it's relatively modest compared to the huge upsurge which had occurred before. And in fact, if we were to track that red graph forward a bit, by 2016, 2017, we were getting back to the level of 2007 and 2008. And over the last couple of years, we began to move beyond it with a continuing rapid rise in real household incomes. So that's one side of it. Now, the other, I think, really unusual, well, relatively unusual feature of that experience in Ireland is that this surge in prosperity has been widely shared. And the blue bar charts on the right show the growth in household income by decile of equivalized income over the same period. And what's extraordinary here is the degree to which virtually all deciles have shared in the upsurge. The bottom decile a bit less than everybody else, but even there, the growth in household income was of the order of 95%. And then the next two deciles were the ones that actually fared best of all. So this broad sharing of income, if we look at how exceptional this was in international terms, here we have from work that Brian Nolan did with colleagues in Oxford, the Irish experience here is compared with a number of Northern European countries. You see that Finland is here with Finland didn't have the recession of 2008 and 2009, but neither did it have the surge in prosperity of the previous period. Greece, on the other hand, did have some degree of an upsurge, but it had a far more severe downturn. And the downturn was such that by 2012, 2013, the Greeks in general were worse off than they had been 25 years earlier. And likewise here, if we look at this table here on the right-hand side, we're looking at growth in the median household income over this period. The annual growth rate per year in Ireland was 3.19%, second highest in the OECD. Again, quite an extraordinary performance in this regard. Now, Finland isn't too bad in this context, but there is a number of countries, the United States, say very poor growth, Germany, and so on. So maybe this is what's generated the contentment. It's simply a matter of people being more prosperous. The change in the trend in inequality is likewise fairly favourable in Ireland in comparative terms, and that across the OECD, the Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality, has risen a bit. In other words, inequality got a bit worse over the period from around the mid-1980s to the early part of the 2010-2015 period. In Ireland, it got somewhat better. And Finland there is an interesting case, because Finland belonged to the Nordic region in the 1980s, where income inequality was extremely low. It has risen since then. It has not reached the level of your typical Western democracy in the meantime, but it's an awful lot worse off than it was. And so it indicates that there's a substantial portion of the population in Finland towards the bottom who may have become worse off over this period. And maybe that's partly what is driving movements like the rise of the True Finns party in Finland. So that's one line of explanation for it, that it's all about the money. It's the economy, stupid. And when people are prospering, they're far more likely to be contented with the system than otherwise. Now, there is probably some truth in this, but there's another side to this that I wanted to mention as well, and this has to do with the longer term indications in Ireland that there is a very strong pull towards the middle ground in Irish political culture, that there is a tradition of consensus, of middle groundism that has been enforced by cultural developments as much as by anything else. And here we move into the territory of culture and identity politics, because it's been said now in many countries that really it's very hard to explain the way people's resentments are being expressed or are developing if we look solely at economic interests, if only because in many cases those who may have suffered economically often express their resentment through support for political movements that actually do nothing to further their economic interests. This is an argument that's been made especially about Trump and the Republicans in the United States, and perhaps also about the Brexit movement, or the role of UKIP in the United Kingdom and the impact it's had on the Conservative Party. Now, this points to other areas like religious change, cultural conflict, and political consensus, and how they interrelate to each other. And the suggestion I would like to make here is that on the one hand, we're very conscious of the history since the 1970s of repeated controversy over moral issues in Ireland, beginning with contraception and ranging through divorce, abortion, gay rights, and same-sex marriage, and so on. And we've had a long history of conflict between Catholic conservatives, or what's often called Catholic conservatism, and secular liberalism, as a result of this movement. And one might have thought that this would provide fertile ground for the emergence of a type of identity politics, of a type which I must say is particularly strong in the United States. And it's very striking that in the United States, the abortion issue came on the scene in 1973 with the Roe versus Wade judgment. And it is just as alive today. In fact, it is now a major driving that the division that has arisen over abortion in the United States is a major factor in virtually every aspect of political and public life in the United States. Now, in Ireland, we've had our periods of controversy and political contest over abortion, but each time it crops up, it is controversial for a time, and then we simply move on. Now, in the abortion issue in Ireland, recently, the repeal of the Eighth Amendment in 2015, one might have thought that this would reverberate and would be a cause of continuing controversy in Ireland. But in fact, at no point over the last 50 years has any of these issues gained legs beyond the immediate controversy that arose in connection with those issues. So we've had various constitutional referenda on abortion and divorce, but in each case, those who are most active in those controversies more or less withdrew from public life until the next controversy over those same issues arose. In other words, they did not hitch up with a political movement and try to capitalize on the discontent that may have arisen over these cultural issues and develop them into a larger focus of political controversy. And again, the experience in the United States is very instructive here. When Roe versus Wade came on the scene in 1973, the American Supreme Court judgment, for the first, until it wasn't really until 1978-79 that it began to become an issue of political controversy. And it did become a politically controversial because until that point, abortion had been largely dismissed by a majority of the religiously active in the United States, namely those who were active in the various Protestant traditions, particularly in the Southern Baptist tradition, the white Southern Baptist tradition. They had steered clear of abortion because it was identified as a Catholic topic. And there was a strong strand of anti-Catholicism in Southern American Protestantism in that period. But the Jerry Falwell, in particular with the moral majority movement in 1978-79, seems to have come to a realization that abortion was actually an issue that could be capitalized on as a way of rousing up intense sentiment and hitching it to the fortunes of the Republican Party. And so the moral majority movement rode in behind Ronald Reagan in 1979 and did a lot. In fact, it's how much exactly, but did a lot to win the election for Ronald Reagan in the presidential election of the United States for Ronald Reagan in 1980. And so this alliance between a religious issue and a political issue became a defining feature of American politics, but no such alliance ever emerged in Ireland. Some of the major figures that we identify as active, I often think, for example, of William Binchy, who was very influential in the 1980s and 1990s in the controversies over abortion and divorce, never made any appearance really in public life on any other issues apart from those. And certainly they all steered clear of party politics, and likewise party politics steered clear of these issues as much as possible and tried to leave it to national votes in things like referenda and so on. And there has been no election over the last 50 years where disagreement over issues like divorce, abortion, contraception, or gay rights has been a significant issue in the election. There was only one instance where an important development in party politics was tied to these issues. This was the founding of the Progressive Democrats in 1985, where Desi O'Malley and a number of other senior Fianna Fáil figures were becoming disenchanted with many aspects of Charles Haughey's leadership of Fianna Fáil, but one of them was his stance on contraception. And in the 1987 general election, there was some surfacing of a stance on contraception as an election issue. But I think that is the only general election since the early 1970s where that could be said to be true. And since the resurgence of the abortion issue in 2011, in none of the general elections that we've had in that period, the abortion issue is dealt with separately from general elections, separately from party politics, and has never surfaced. Now, I would therefore tend to make the case that this way of dealing with these cultural and identity issues, to segment them off, deal with them in their own terms, and those who are active in dealing with those issues in their own terms make no connections with any other realms of politics. That this has actually been a fairly important part of the preservation of a kind of a very strong consensual middle ground tendency in Irish politics. And we don't get this theme that has emerged in many other countries where, say, various kinds of media, like, say, it might be thought of as the likes of, say, RTE or the Irish Times are as identified by populist politicians as an elite, fake news, as sources of ideas that can't be trusted, that are sort of betraying the true tradition of Ireland or whatever. We simply don't get that kind of discourse in Ireland. And even though, say, with the emergence of Sinn Féin might have been thought of as a major change in the political traditions in recent times, they have never gone down that road of seriously challenging the sort of major cultural institutions of Irish life along those lines. So I would just leave it at that and say that I think that there are these two features of Irish life, that there is this background of a very strong tradition of, I would call it middle groundism, the opposite of polarization, that has remained intact despite these conflicts over certain issues over the last 50 years, particularly the cultural issues, and even in the periods when we were doing badly economically in the 1970s and early 1980s, we didn't really get the kinds of populist movements that have occurred elsewhere. And that it's how to explain it is another matter, but I think it's a feature of Irish life that's worth taking account of. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tony. As it always, thought-provoking. So now it's question time. Now we have had one comment in from Audrey Reid on what you to say, Tony, reminding you of Lucinda Creighton, I suppose, as being another breakaway party formed around the abortion issue.
In fact, I would say Lucinda Creighton is a very good illustration of what I'm talking of, in that she broke away from Fine Gael after they introduced legislation on abortion in 2011. But of course, and founded a new political party, Renua. But of course, Renua never got anybody elected, and she faded out of political life quite quickly afterwards. And indeed, I think made strenuous efforts afterwards to say that she didn't want to be seen simply as an anti-abortion politician. Likewise, Sean Tobin with Sinn Féin as a breakaway as a consequence of the Repeal the Eighth movement recently. Another instance with the founding of his political party, again, really made no headway with it. So I think this is really the point I'm making, that these instances have gone nowhere, whereas in other countries they've gotten legs and become major parts of political life in their societies.
Now, I've got a couple of comments in and questions. So first of all, I want to have one to Pete, and I suppose it's about our polarized society next door or up the road. You talked about countries which have a more dominant neighbour doing better on COVID, but the North has done much poorer than we have down here, and poorer than the mainland. So would you like to comment on that one, Pete? And then I'm going to come to a series of questions coming in now from various people for Tony.
Yeah, so I find myself in the awkward position of the Englishman who's been here nearly 20 years and is now an Irishman, technically, talking about the North. Never my favourite position to find myself in, but I mean, clearly there's a cohesion problem there. I mean, clearly, trying to solve a collective action problem through common group identity is going to be more difficult there. I think for a long period, though, I mean, the North actually did really quite well on COVID numbers compared to England. And I think part of the reason for that was probably having good neighbours, frankly, because that was also extremely important to keeping the numbers down. But obviously that's been less the case over the last couple of months or so. I think what is amazing to me about this issue is the degree to which it was predictable. I mean, that was the point I was trying to make, I think. And I think, tying the two talks together and talking about what Tony was talking about the polarization thing. I mean, it was entirely predictable that in the UK things would go the way that they did, and entirely predictable, I think, that in the US, I mean, not the exact waves, but that they would struggle more than other countries to get this kind of collective response. And, looking back across the water to my former home, I mean, it's been despairing in many ways, the inevitability with which it would end up dividing along party lines as well, where there is this kind of right-wing rump of the Tory party that's refusing to recognise the situation that they are in and is undermining the cohesiveness that the other wing of the party is trying to generate in order to respond to the crisis. And that's just steadily grown over a period of time. Now, again, trying to tie the two talks together, Edna, I want to ask Tony a question, if I can, which is on that exact issue. Because I think one thing that, for me anyway, as the outsider who came here and was really struck by the centrism of Irish politics, you know, the not being this left-right divide and trying to get my head around where it all came from. I mean, I wonder if a contender for this kind of consensus centrism, Tony, is recruitment into political parties, that the kind of cultural issues that you are referring to are not closely linked to the values on which people join political parties in Ireland. They join political parties in Ireland on the basis of different values and different kind of cultural and historic attachments. Whereas in the kind of countries that have got these stronger left-right divides, like the UK and the US, you join a political party because you identify with them on that divide, and they're strongly correlated with these cultural issues. So I think it becomes advantageous for political parties to take a stance on the cultural issues. Whereas in Ireland, I don't think a political party can afford to, because it would rip itself in two the minute it tried, because there are liberals and conservatives in all of the parties, because that's not what causes them to join. So I wonder actually if it's partly to do with an historic accident of who joins parties and what the mix within parties is that constrains how extreme political parties can go.
Well,
Before Tony comes back on that, I've got a couple of more questions for Tony that have come in on the Q&A. And I suppose one that a couple of people have raised, Barra Rowntree and Anne-Marie McGowan, has been intergenerational solidarity. Is that breaking down? And particularly around things like housing and the intergenerational differential effect of the pandemic on different generations. So maybe answer those as well.
Well, just to take Pete's point first, there is an interesting literature on Christian democracy that makes the argument that in countries which have had a strong Christian democratic tradition, they've tried to underplay the nature of Christian democratic parties going back to the 1930s and 1940s, and particularly in the post-war period, was that they formed on the basis of identity centered on Christianity, but at the same time, were highly consensual. They arose in contexts where, in fact, they were trying to minimize the left-right divide. And therefore, you know, in say their association with trade unions, for example, particularly in Germany, where you get a cooperative approach between trade unions and employers, that there is a kind of a leaning towards consensual or collective decision making in that regard. So certainly the political parties in Ireland they are all clustered towards the middle, and it is true to say that there is often, as you know, the conservative liberal divide often occurs, or even the left-right divide often occurs as much within political parties as it does in political parties. So yes, how that has happened is another story. Now, on this question about the intergenerational divides that have emerged, and it's certainly true that, you know, objective distribution of resources Ireland isn't particularly outstanding over the last 30 or 40 years in its egalitarianism. Now, it was relatively inegalitarian back in the 1980s, and because it hasn't become more so over the intervening period, whereas many other countries have actually got worse than Ireland in that regard, or they have gone in that direction. The gap, say, between the Nordic welfare states and Ireland in regard to income inequality is less now than it was, because they have worsened rather than because Ireland have become better. So these differentials which have arisen, and the new ones that those questioners talked about on, say, housing, or the burden sharing, or the burden of COVID, there are gaps, and it could well be possible that some political leader in the future will capitalize on these gaps in ways that we have not yet imagined. I think by trying to capitalize them on their own isn't likely going to be very effective. But what tends to happen in countries where you do get populist upsurge is that economic discontent is tied in with anti-immigrant feeling, scapegoating. It's someone who's willing to be a rabble-rouser and say outrageous things and challenge the liberal consensus or the dominant consensus. That's what turns it into a populist movement. I must say I'm inclined to lean a lot towards this supply side notion of populism, that it requires a determined set of, maybe a determined individual or a set of political leaders who has the skill and the communication ability and the organizational drive, or whatever it might be, the leadership ability to whip up populist sentiment. I think the surveys show that there's as much anti-immigrant feeling in the Irish population as there is in many other. There's as much prejudice towards immigrants in Ireland as there is anywhere else. But no political movement has tried to capitalize on it. That may well be the difference. And therefore it doesn't get ramped up even further.
Well, Tony, I would personally have had experience of people ramping up anti-traveller issues.
Yes,
in my political career, but
yes, you
successfully. But the other set of questions, says a few people have come in around.
Just before you ask the question, Edna, I was going to suggest if Tony could stop sharing his screen, we could get both him and Pete up there, just so the attendees can see their faces. Am
I not? Oh,
you're sharing.
Oh, yeah, stop sharing. Oh, yes, I see what you mean. Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions that are around trust and the kind of discourse we have, trust in the media. So Dorothy Watson and Carmel Hannon have raised that, and the importance of I suppose maintaining trust in keeping trust in the political system, that wider area of civic trust.
I'll happily take that. I've been convinced for some time that one of the other factors at play here is the fracturing of the media, and in two senses actually. I mean, both in COVID and also with reference to some of the wider things that Tony's been talking about here in terms of polarization. So just to explain quickly, I mean, it was fascinating in Ireland watching what happened as the COVID pandemic took hold to people's media watching, because we were tracking it. So the behavioural change subgroup could see it. And there was this flood into news media. There was a huge increase in attention given to news media. But it really went back to traditional sources. So RTE was just bagging the overwhelming majority of people. So even where people who'd left RTE and gone to independent providers, they were all flooding back in. And I think in a small country that does not have very fractured media, there's a huge advantage because it acts like the village green. I mean, it's the place where people come together to coordinate and they're all listening to the same arguments and the same conversation. And that probably really helps. I think another factor that can drive polarization, I mean, Tony's talking about the supply side. Yes, but someone's got to give them the oxygen as well. And I think in a fractured media where the media itself divides along political lines, along conservative liberal lines, you know, where you have multi-channel, where actually the media providers are trying to target a segmented market. They have a particular political audience in mind with who they target. I think that makes a real difference to the ability of the supply side to actually kick in. So I think both in terms of COVID and trying to coordinate and in terms of what can lead to polarization, the role of how fragmented or how cohesive the media is, I think is super important.
I would even extend that to research institutes. I worked in the ESRI for 15 years in the 1990s and early 2000s. And one of the things that used to strike me at the time, and still does, is that in places like Britain or the United States, research institutes went, their influence faded with the rise and fall of political parties. So when in Britain, when the Labour Party was in power, one set of research institutes was influential. And then when the governments changed, another set came to the fore. And likewise in the United States, of course, one of the driving forces behind the turn to the right in the United States has been these billionaires who funded right-wing research institutes in order to give credence, intellectual credence to extreme right-wing points of view. But in Ireland, it didn't make any difference who was in office. The ESRI had more or less the same position, irrespective of change of government. And you got the same level of indifference to what it was saying, but also attention to what it was saying. And there wasn't it. And I must say, I think this is it's quite indicative of the kind of thing I'm talking about. That the change in political parties that are in office doesn't affect. They're not taking a stance either on RTE or on the newspapers. And I think you're right, Pete, about RTE. It does play the role of a kind of a village hall where everybody can come and say their pieces. You know, where Joe Duffy's phone-in program gives a voice to all kinds of people, but it's the same organisation as puts out Today Tonight. Whereas, you know, the polarisation of the media, even in Britain, and certainly in the United States, is quite extraordinary now. And some people simply never hear each other because they don't share the same media world in any way. And that is not at all the situation here.
But does polarised social media, you know, where people are in their Facebook groups, the Gemmas and so on of this world, create that space for people outside of the mainstream media?
It may do, but it hasn't yet translated into anything visible. You know, in the election that we had earlier, when was it, January or February, this year's election, there may have been a lot of action on the media, on the social media, but they weren't doing anything radically different than what was going on in the mainstream media. Or at least, you know, nobody suddenly popped up getting a huge share of the vote and people are scratching their heads. We never heard of these people. Where did they come from? And someone turns around and said, well, they were actually very big on Facebook. You just weren't looking at the right kinds of media. We simply haven't heard that. Whereas in the Brexit vote in Britain, there was a feeling that what was one of the reasons people are so surprised by the result is that a lot of the discourse that led to the Brexit vote was happening outside of the mainstream media.
I'd like to come in on that because there's some empirics that's relevant. So in the US, of course, they've tracked some of this polarization for quite a long time. So the best data comes out of the US. One of the really interesting things, one of the best questions actually for tracking polarization is to ask people whether they'd be okay if their son or daughter or a close family member were to marry one of the other lot. And would they find this okay or not? It's a really nice question, and it's been asked now for about 50 years in the United States. And the interesting thing is, two things actually. One is polarization precedes social media by a very substantial amount. So polarization began in the US in the 1970s and accelerated through the 80s and 90s. The other thing that's really interesting is there's no evidence that polarization is stronger among among internet users and non-internet users. If you take people who don't use the internet, polarization has grown in that group as well as in the internet group. So it may be the case that social media feeds into polarization, but it's not a primary driving force because polarization predates it, the trend does. And also it's strong among people who don't use social media, in fact, slightly stronger, according to the study that I saw. That suggests to me that the entire media is going, the fracturing of the entire media, the echo chamber actually was happening long before social media came along, although it's probably contributing to it.
One of the comments here is that young people on social media are growing. There's a growing left-wing populism reflected in the growth in the youth vote for Sinn Féin. That's the question here. And another comment here, time for social disruption in Ireland and the opportunity for that divisive politics as people who were not born in Ireland attempt to assert their social, economic and human rights. And I have another question in asking whether there are more or fewer people of different ethnic backgrounds in Finland in elected office than there would be in Ireland.
Okay. I would think that Sinn Féin, I wouldn't think it counts as a populist party in the same sense, not in the sense of, say, the True Finns or Alternative for Deutschland or the National Front in France or UKIP in the United Kingdom or Trumpism in the United States. It is certainly more left-wing than traditional Irish political parties, but it sort of participates in the mainstream institutions and sort of, I suppose, bows to them or accepts them. And again, media, you don't hear Sinn Féin launching barrages of criticism against RTE, for example, or the Irish Times, or talking about corrupt elites. Certainly they might talk of Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael politicians in unfavourable terms. But populism is, when they speak of a corrupt elite, they're talking of a much wider, they're talking to say the judiciary, the universities, the research institutes, the media, they're all spoken of as part of a cabal that are betraying the true traditions of the nation in question. So, and I don't think Sinn Féin, there's a certain degree of left-wing radicalism and maybe a certain amount of economic populism, but I don't think that qualifies it as a populist party in the same sense as you see arising in other countries. And I suppose one of the interesting things recently is that the one major issue in which Sinn Féin deviated from the mainstream for a long time was on membership of the European Union. But of course, it has changed in recent times, largely, in fact, because of the Brexit vote in Northern Ireland, where suddenly membership of the European Union becomes an important expression of national sovereignty or national independence in Ireland.
So, I remember hearing somebody on RTE actually saying that that the European referenda were the gift that kept on giving for Sinn Féin, because they hoovered up all the publicity on being on the no side for the Lisbon Treaty and a whole lot of others.
Yeah.
I quite like to make a couple of quick points if I can. One, on the populism thing, I think there is some populism in Irish politics. I think some of it exists within the kind of fractured left-wing groups, but I think it's particularly where you have these kind of local champion type politicians, of which we have a number, and they do use very standard populist tactics in terms of their rhetoric and the way they try to communicate and so on. So I think there is an element of populism here, and I think some of the forces are shared with those bigger international forces, but for loads of the reasons Tony's highlighted and other things that have been said here. I mean, it's never taken hold in that real national sense as it has elsewhere. On the generational divide, I mean, I think the truth of the matter is, I mean, I worry about the intergenerational stuff. I worry about it with climate change and environmental problems as well, because I think that's a place where it could also become an issue. But it is pretty clear that you can express your view at the ballot box, and people are doing. So we can see patterns in the way that different ages are voting and the mobilization of political force. And I think these divisions are much more dangerous, where people are actually arguing that somehow it's the process of democracy itself, or that there's elite and they've got no voice. And that's when it becomes really problematic. And I think at the moment we don't have that.
Another comment has come in about what do you think that the GAA, what role it has played in kind of social cohesion in Ireland? Maybe within parishes, as distinct from between parish rivalries.
Yeah. Well, I will say, I think the GAA is an organisation that in different circumstances could have become a vehicle for a very strident form of kind of populist nationalism, preserving Irish tradition and so on. And in fact, I think not only is it a very strong community organisation, but it has in recent times deliberately tried to present itself as a unifier, as a mechanism for integration. So, the GAA is very proud of these occasions where you get, people from Bangladesh or from exotic foreign regions turning up on county teams, and this is seen as a kind of a badge of pride. And I haven't been following this recently with the GAA, but I think they've been making fairly, they have a fairly strong record of trying to devise, mechanisms of integration. Now, whether they work or not is one question, but the important thing is that they're not doing the opposite. In fact, it could easily have happened that they would have been doing the opposite. And there would be many countries where organizations like that are strongly associated with national cultural traditions would be doing the opposite. And they would be a kind of organization that could be drafted in to whip up a kind of a nationalist xenophobia, socially conservative, suspicious of the urban elites and so on. But that simply isn't what has happened in the case of the GAA. In fact, I would say it's the opposite.
I actually served for a bit on the GAA's inclusion committee, and they did very, very interesting work there. in reaching across the divides, the different divides, including reaching to the newer arrivals on our shores as well. I think it played an important role at that level. I've got a few other points that are coming through. One of the points that the level of cohesiveness politically around key national interest issues such as EU Brexit and the early lockdown, do you feel, Pete, that assists compliance or just antagonises those who are just outside the consensus? What's modern read?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I think if I've understood, sorry.
Is I suppose that if people feel that 70–80% of people feel one way, do the other 20% feel very excluded?
There is some evidence that there is a discontent minority in COVID. It's very weak and it's very small. Actually, one of my favorite questions that we ask is we ask a 7-point question about compliance rather than are you not, or what behaviors are you engaging in, so that people can say, you know, if they really want to, they can say, you know, I fundamentally reject this and disagree with it. 1 out of 7, I reject it, I don't do it. They're so small you can't count them. So what you actually get is you get a distribution where the majority will just give it 7 out of 7, usually somewhere in the mid-50s. Then you've got people at kind of 6, 5 and 4, and the younger people tend to be more in the 6s and the 5s rather than the 7s. Because they're pushing the boundaries more and it's harder for them, and all, you know, they've taken this big well-being hit and all that kind of thing. But what's so interesting is the distribution is entirely skewed up to the we're in favor of doing this, it's just we don't always do it end. There's almost nobody who's outright rejecting it. Where there is rejection, it's primarily industrial and sectoral. I mean, it's people saying that we're going about this the wrong way and we're causing damage to jobs and closing things down and so on. And, you know, you understand that because there are certain sectors that are getting absolutely clobbered. But I mean, there really isn't any strong movement among the population in general to say that the tack that we've taken is just plain wrong.
I think one of the things that's very striking about Ireland compared to a lot of other countries, if you compare it, say, to the US, is the very big consensus we would have, say, around the social welfare system. And, you know, where welfare in the US is a dirty word, where here it's still regarded as meaning well-being and a good thing. And that's something that absolutely survives changes of government. And there's almost nobody who's against it in the Dáil. So that some of the issues that are very polarizing issues in other societies are part of a much broader kind of social safety net consensus that we would have here.
Yeah, it is the case that the degree to which the benefits of the economic growth of the last 25 or 30 years have been shared, they've come down very much to distributive policy implemented by government, because we know that on market forces on their own create very wide gaps in income in Irish society, and it is the tax benefit system which evens out the difference. And it is true to say that the basic shape of the tax benefit system has been in place now for decades and really hasn't at any point been fundamentally challenged. You know, we never had a Maggie Thatcher moment or a Ronald Reagan moment in Ireland where someone got into office on the basis that this whole system was wasteful and corrupt and had to be reformed, that there has been an adherence to the basics. Now, a lot of people will be dissatisfied with it on a lot of detail, and they will argue over what their share should be and who should be paying, and that's a normal part of democratic politics. And I'm not saying that there are no divides. I think what I'm talking about, and I saw one of the comments that popped up on the screen here talking about Gaelscoileanna versus Educate Together as a form of division in Irish society. And of course, there are dozens and dozens of such divisions. But the point is that they don't sort of coalesce together into forming a major cultural cleavage. You could imagine, for example, in some traditions where you might get an education movement which was trying to preserve national traditions, maybe on both religious grounds and linguistic grounds, was very hostile to taking in immigrants, very antagonistic towards the liberal secular tradition in education, the internationalism, and so on and so on and so on, and that would get tied up. A whole lot of these would all get bundled together. You know, you get this very odd combination of those in the Republican Party say they're in favor of guns and God. It's all about gun rights and God. Now there's an odd conjunction, but they have become conjoined, and there's a race element in it, and there's the Midwest versus the coasts, the liberal and so on. It's when these join together and become a source of major cleavage. Right? It's when, in fact, in normal democratic politics, what happens is that all of the divides there, they cut across each other and they sort of cancel each other out. So you're opposed to some people on one grounds, but actually you share a lot of common ground on other grounds. So
I'm surprised, Tony, you didn't talk about social class.
Well, yes, this is in political science. There's been a puzzlement as to why class politics never surfaced that strongly in Ireland. Now, there's a long tradition of trying to explain this. One factor that people sometimes talk about is the role of property ownership, that even the working class managed to become property owners, and that in fact, this may well have been a deliberate ploy going right back to the 1930s and 40s, when the agricultural labourers were enabled to buy out their council houses.
And the far left parties are opposed to property taxes.
They're opposed. Well, that's one of the unusual things about far left. There's very few far left parties in the Western world that are opposed to property tax, but they are in Ireland, which means that it's this idea of horseshoe politics, that they're actually sharing the same kind of outlook as those who are very much further up on the income ladder. So maybe that's another instance where there's a surprising absence of division on certain key issues.
Well, I think we've had a really interesting discussion and two very interesting papers. I know there's a few questions there. It's hard to summarize them, but you have them yourselves on the Q&A. So if you want to respond to any of the individual points, I've tried to summarize a few of them as they've come along. But on behalf of the Irish Social Policy Association, I want to say a very special thank you to Pete and to Tony. And unfortunately, we can't celebrate in the normal way by going for a pint or a glass together after this. But when the pandemic is over, you're owed a pint each. We look forward to that.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you indeed. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.